Welcome everyone to Disruptions of Olympic Proportions. I'm Suzanne Willever, Associate Director of Outreach and Academic Initiatives at Education Abroad. I'd like to thank you for joining us today as we conclude the second day of International Education Week 2021 with this important topic. On the heels of the Tokyo Games and looking forward to Beijing and the future of the most iconic global sports competition, we are pleased to bring together faculty experts from Temple's campuses in Japan, Italy, and the US to discuss how global disruption has affected the Olympic and Paralympic Games. Our panelists will address topics such as the effects of the global pandemic, social media, inequities, and economic implications, and will consider how disruption may present opportunities for the future of the Games. It is my honor to introduce our moderator, Dr. Michael Leeds, Professor of Economics at Temple University. Dr. Leeds earned his PhD in economics from Kingston University. His research has appeared in such journals as the Journal of Urban Economics, Economic Inquiry, Social Science Quarterly, and the Journal of Sports Economics. He is co-author of The Economics of Sports and co-editor of the Handbook on the Economics of Women in Sports. His current research focuses on gender differences in response to economic contests. And from 2007 to 2009, he was Assistant Dean at Temple University, Japan campus. Welcome, Dr. Leeds.
Thank you, Suzanne. And it is my distinct pleasure to introduce today's panel. We start with Dr. Jeremy Jordan, Senior Associate Dean and Professor of Sport and Recreation Management in the School of Tourism and Hospitality Management on Temple's main campus. Dr. Jordan is the Senior Associate Dean of the School of Sport, Tourism and Hospitality Management, where he also serves as a Professor of Sport and Recreation Management. His research examines consumer expectations and satisfaction, motives for participation, commitment to the event, and economic activity. Additionally, Dr. Jordan works closely with the Temple Department of Athletics, for which he serves as the university's NCAA Faculty Athletics Representative. Welcome, Dr. Jordan. We also have Dr. Deborah Blair, Associate Professor and Director of Organizational Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the School of Sport, Tourism, and Hospitality Management on Temple's main campus. Dr. Blair specializes in sport and recreation management. Her industry experience spans over 25 years, designing and implementing inclusive sport, tourism, and leisure programs and events. She has served on numerous local, regional, and national committees, including the Philadelphia Mayor's Commission on People with Disabilities, and she has consulted with various agencies and committees regarding the development of inclusive practices. Dr. Blair is also area coordinator for the General Education Race and Diversity module at Temple University. Welcome, Dr. Blair. Francesco Castiglione, Professor Francesco Castiglione is a professor of sport and recreation management in the School of Sport, Tourism, and Hospitality Management at Temple's Rome campus. So we are particularly glad he is here so late in the evening for him. Professor Castiglione earned an MA in sport management from La Sapienza Università di Roma in Italy. He is a professional volleyball coach for the Italian Volleyball Federation. He is also a coaches clinic director and has extensive experience managing local and international sporting events. Professor Castiglione is involved in several different projects with the Italian Olympic Committee for National Sport Federations and has taught sport management courses for Italian and foreign universities in Rome. Welcome, Professor Castiglione.
Thank you.
Finally, last but certainly not least, we have Professor Jeffrey Kingston, Dr. Jeffrey Kingston, Professor and Director of Asian Studies in the College of Liberal Arts at Temple University, Japan. So he is joining us extremely early, and we're particularly grateful for that. Dr. Kingston currently serves as the Director of Asian Studies at Temple University, Japan. He has written and been published extensively on topics related to the political economy and social history of modern Japan and nationalism in Asia. His work has been represented on CNN, The Guardian, The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, and other world-renowned publications. He is an authority on contemporary Japan, its history, and political economy. And of course, Dr. Kingston joins us from Tokyo, the host city for the 2020 or 2021, who's counting, Olympics. So just to give you an idea of what's coming, we're going to first ask a common question and just go down our panel and ask them to respond to a given question. And then we will have a series of questions that individual members of our panel will feel free to answer. We will then open the floor to questions from the audience. So if you do have a question, please be sure to put it in the chat. I will also ask our panelists to please put themselves on mute just so we don't have any stray sounds unless they are actively speaking. So we'll go in the order in which they were introduced, beginning with Professor Jordan. And I just want to start with, again, a general question, which is the global pandemic obviously had tremendous disruptive effects on many aspects of the world economy, on societies and culture. And I'd like to get your perspectives on how the pandemic disrupted, if you will, the 2020 Olympic Games. So again, we'll start with Professor Jordan.
Thanks, Professor Leeds, and thanks everyone for being part of this panel and for allowing me to be a part of it. It's obviously a very interesting topic, especially from my discipline, sport management, to understand, as Professor Leeds says, the disruption that was caused. I suppose the easy answer is the Olympic Games was delayed a year because of the pandemic, and just the difficulty and cost associated with that. But it was like no other Olympic Games that we've seen, at least I've seen in my lifetime, in terms of the adjustments that had to be made. It was estimated to be the most expensive summer games, or games in general, in history. There's a little bit of discrepancy about the Beijing Summer Games a few years ago and how they allocated costs. So we can say it's one of the most, if not the most expensive games. And so a big part of why you host as a country, there are many reasons, but one is how you can highlight the destination and how you can create tourism during the games, but then a flow on post games. And so all the things that you put into place to capitalize on tourists being in your country were no longer available. Hospitality, food and beverage, tourist attractions, even merchandise sales. Everything in around the games was interrupted. And so the cost, the loss of revenue was significant. And so I think, I don't want to steal everyone else's answer, so I'll probably close there, but it's just probably the most disruption we've seen in an Olympic Games, again, in my lifetime. And I'm not as young as I used to be, so that probably goes back a little ways. So thanks.
Thank you. Dr. Blair, your perspectives.
Yeah, I would agree. And I'm going to come from the angle of looking at this from the Paralympic athlete perspective to some degree. But I would agree with Dr. Jordan. The impact is tremendous, from everything from the athletes' preparation and training for the games, as well as all the way through the execution of the games, all the restrictions that have been put in place and that continue to be put in place as we look forward to Beijing. But two things that, particularly stand out for me from a Paralympic perspective is, these are elite athletes. And so everyone, for anyone that the idea of training or the anticipation of, years and years of work or hours and hours of study to take an exam, the build up to that. So to have that year where there's this complete stoppage, all the things that an athlete has worked for and planned for to come to a complete halt was tremendous. For a Paralympic athlete, the isolation, the layering of the isolation of being a person with a disability, and now being this elite athlete that is, their dreams have been disrupted. It was pretty significant. There are a lot of studies right now that are looking at and investigating the potential psychological distresses around all of these delays and postponement of the games. From a para perspective, also, I would say, the restrictions around COVID and the misinformation and the lack of understanding of of how COVID was really going to impact an individual, many of those athletes had going into it, had underlying medical conditions, immune deficits, chronic disorders that made them really susceptible to potentially, significant impacts, life-threatening impacts should they test positive. So, understanding what those protocols were going to be that seemed to fluctuate quite a bit, and making sure that, for themselves and everyone around them, that safety and protocols for, safe, clean conditions was paramount. And the trauma around preparing for that was significant. And I don't think it's going to be much different as we look at planning for Beijing as well.
Thank you. Now to Professor Castiglione. Please unmute.
Thank you, Michael, and hello, everyone. Thanks for having me with you. I'm very glad to be part of this panel. I speak from the sport point of view as a coach, as a sport organizer. I agree with the professor that were before me, and this is has been a very expensive Olympic edition, but we have to think that also for the national teams that had to participate, it has been a big effort to be able to participate. So it's not only the cost of the Olympic itself for the Japanese organization, but it's the cost for the athletes to be there, for the National Olympic Committees, for the teams. They had to be prepared, and they had to delay for 1 year the qualification tournament. Some athletes didn't make it because 1 year late, maybe you're not in time anymore. Someone made it because they arrived to the performance. And what is interesting to say, like Professor Blair, I have a focus on the Paralympic game, and we have to say that the number of coaches allowed to go to the Olympic was much lower than before. So the Paralympic athlete had an hard time to handle the situation, and especially during the games and the preparation, there was a big difficulty to prepare those athletes with prostheses that they had to change, and every time during practice, and they were used to have many different assistants. So this had a big impact on their performance, and also to the strength that they put in this. And another important point is that we see that the medal distribution in the Paralympic in the different continents gave the result that the south part of the world, Africa included, they had 30% less medals compared with the Rio 2016. Thank you.
Interesting. And finally, Professor Kingston, your perspectives.
Yeah, I think people have covered a lot of the bases here. Abe conceived this, Shinzo Abe, the prime minister, Japan's longest serving prime minister, conceived of this as a legacy project. When he made the bid, there really wasn't much public support, but I think the government saw this as a great branding opportunity. And who could ever have anticipated how that would be derailed by the pandemic? But even before the pandemic, there are a lot of problems, and Japan was lurching from one crisis to another. There was the original stadium design that most people didn't like, so they replaced that. There was the plagiarized logo, allegations that Japan secured the bid through corruption. It just kept going on. And Abe and Suga, his successor, were downsized by the pandemic. And this, of course, affected perceptions of the Olympics, which were closely tied to them. So I think that outside Japan, there's a perception that, the pandemic was fairly well managed. And the total number of deaths fairly low, the outbreak relatively contained. But that is not the view from inside Japan. And both prime ministers were hammered over what was seen as their poor crisis management. And both were hammered for appearing to prioritize holding the games over public health. And neither one recovered from that perception. So I think that, branding opportunities were squandered. Japan has so many virtues. Now, one is meticulous attention to detail, seamlessly rolling out programs. But the vaccination program was chaotic at best, very slow. Just 10% of Japanese were vaccinated by the end of June. And when the Olympic opening games were held, about 23, 24% of Japanese had been double jabbed. Now, given that the government had such a long lead time, knowing when the Olympics were going to be held, from the first outbreak in Japan of February 2020, it just seems mind-boggling that it did not do a better job on vaccinations. Now, since then, it did very well, but running up to the Olympics, all of the prime minister's top advisors said, don't hold the Olympics. All the top, medical organizations said it's too risky. But Suga decided, look, if I cancel, I lock in the political downside. And that means his career is toast. So if we go ahead and things work out, perhaps, I can bask in the reflected glory. Japan had a record medal haul. There was quite a buzz, but it didn't help Suga because there was also a surge in COVID cases during the Olympics, not caused by the Olympians, but because there was a festive atmosphere, people let down their guard, the Delta variant was swirling. So there's a huge surge in number of cases, lack of, hospital infrastructure to deal with them, and that led to Suga's ouster. The other big issue is diversity. They were billed as the Diversity Olympics. And the LDP, the ruling party here, had sort of promised they were going to pass a law banning discrimination against LGBTQ+. But it turned out that they didn't have party members willing to support that. So they pulled the plug on the law, and that never happened. And we can go back to earlier in the year where the head of the Tokyo Olympic Committee, Mori, former prime minister, was saying, well, he didn't like to have too many women at meetings because they talk too much and the meetings go on and on. So I think Human Rights Watch awarded him a gold medal for sexism. Anyway, I'll leave it there and turn to the next question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now, I just want to maybe ask some follow-up questions, and I'll maybe start with one person to get the ball rolling, but then others should feel free to join in. And I guess the first question to follow up on just something that Professor Kingston brought up, that the last two Olympic Games, the Rio Games and the Tokyo Games, have been among the least popular among their own citizenry. Do you think that this is maybe the 2020 games have been a watershed in terms of the desirability of hosting Olympic Games? And we'll start with Dr. Kingston.
Well, I think there's a shrinking pool of candidate cities for a range of reasons, and the pandemic derailed Olympics perhaps highlights some of the risks. I think also there's concern about sort of the unequal relationship between hosting cities and the IOC. And the IOC sort of holds all the cards. And so clearly there were a lot of misgivings in Tokyo about going ahead with the games. The IOC said, well, you signed up, you gotta go forward with this. So there was a sense here that arms were being twisted and that host cities are locked into unfavorable terms. And so I think other host cities in the future may have second thoughts. But besides that, there is the shrinking pool of candidates because of the amount of money involved and the risks to the brand that are, possible. I mean, most cities think, wow, the Olympics, what a great branding opportunity, but it can turn around and the media can play a huge role in that. I'll leave it there.
Would anyone else care to jump in on this?
I think that we have a clear example going back in the Olympics in Greece. Greece wanted so bad to organize the Olympics, and right after the Olympics, they started to have a very economic crisis that then in the past years brought the country almost out of the European community. So countries they love to have the Olympics because also they think that is the chance to build a new transportation system, to build facilities. And I give the example of Rome. Rome was a candidate city in 2024. Actually, I already was working for the organizing committee, and then the new prime minister, Dr. Monti, decided that we didn't run anymore because he didn't want to have the government to cover eventually the cost that was for the Olympics. So we didn't like that, but there are good reasons sometimes to step down.
So there's some thought that the Olympics will soon be only the province of the extremely wealthy nations or of dictatorships that are capable of ignoring the wishes of their people. Do you feel that we are heading in that direction?
I was going to make that same comment, Professor Leeds, that there's been suggestions that there be a rotation system for hosting the Olympic Games because of the infrastructure and the cost associated. If you have been able to build that infrastructure, then obviously the next time the games would come to your destination, it would require less of a financial investment. That does, however, I think, go against this idea of providing opportunities for other countries, but and I think this was mentioned earlier, it's becoming so cost prohibitive. And as Professor Kingston said, there's now oftentimes local resistance for various reasons. One is the financial expense and how maybe that could be used for other public purposes to improve the lives of citizens. So I do think that at some point it's just becomes so expensive that it eliminates certain countries from even considering it.
Thank you.
I'd just like to jump in and add to the point that, yes, democracies may be more vulnerable on that score. And as Mike suggested, maybe not only wealthy countries, but authoritarian governments might have a certain advantage there. So that is not exactly consistent with Olympic values. And I think a lot of people believe that the Olympics in Japan went forward mostly because of financial motivations. NBC had paid a lot of money, sponsors had paid a lot of money, 28 billion was spent on the infrastructure. So, those were big reasons to go forward. And again, not maybe the best look for the Olympics.
Professor Blair, I noticed you unmuted. Do you have something you'd like to?
No, I was going to really address something that Dr. Jordan said. I mean, being cost prohibitive. This morning, actually, the manager for events and logistics for the Olympics and Paralympics spoke to some of our STHM students, and one of the things that he said is in preparation for Beijing is the cost of getting athletes into Beijing is going to probably eliminate some of those smaller countries from even participating, because they're just not going to be able to afford it. I mean, for the U.S., for example, there are no U.S. bound flights that can go into the country. So you're looking at all these other avenues of trying to enter, and the idea of getting charter flights, which are millions and millions of dollars. So if you've got a country that's sending 1 or 2 athletes, it's just not possible. So the idea of these social inequities that are being, exacerbated by these costs and this trying to recoup and potentially, again, recoup the money that you've invested in, being selected for the games. It's a tremendous impact on individuals, and folks are fighting back. Yeah, they're fighting back.
So do you see then the not just hosting the games, but actually participating in the games being restricted to a smaller and smaller group of nations, at least if the conditions that we're operating under persist for some time?
Absolutely. I mean, when you look at, how those athletes, just like professional athletes, those athletes that have the opportunity to train and potentially compete. I mean, your developmental programs, for example, in the past, say, 8 to 10 years, the Team USA has been engaging in a lot of research and self-assessment, looking at not only the internal infrastructure in terms of diversity and inclusion initiatives, but also those national teams and developmental teams. What are they doing to really, be open and more inclusive? It's difficult right now. If you look at Winter Games, the number of diverse athletes that are competing in Winter Games is 0. So it begins to look like privilege once again is going to rear its ugly head and potentially eliminate opportunity for people to have this, even folks that have the capacity to have the opportunity to compete.
And that is actually, you raised something that is not often noted, but it's not just geographical financial problems, but actually sport-related financial problems, that the delay in the Olympics, many people don't realize that the Olympics are a major source of revenue, not just for the IOC and for the organizing committees, but also for international sports federations. And a lot of individual sports suffered tremendously because of the delay and the cut in revenue that has trickled down to them from the Olympics. And perhaps, in fact, as someone who has been an active participant in such a federation, Professor Castiglione, I was wondering if maybe you could speak to that.
Yes, definitely. The participation to Olympic is a big economic effort for every national team and every country. Some countries in the world, they are financed by the government for sport. For example, our model in Europe and in Italy, the national government give 450 million euros every year to the Olympic Committee. Then those money goes to the different sport federation, and having to keep the teams training during the pandemic is highly, it's very costly. What I want to point out that as Professor Blair said, to prepare for the Olympic has a very high cost, and some countries they have other priorities. The priorities now for most of the countries is to get vaccinated the population. So nowadays, some countries, they don't even think, to spend money for the athletes to prepare for the Olympics, because nowadays we still have a world crisis. And I think that this discussion that we're having today should bring up the Olympic spirit that might be changed. The Olympic family should change. And as Professor Jordan said, following the Olympic spirit, it would be important that the rotation of the organization of the Olympic would be something that really will be put on place sometimes.
Okay. Dr. Blair, I want to follow up something you raised earlier when you were talking about the Paralympics, and maybe you could expand a little bit on the differences in the way that this pandemic has disrupted the Paralympics versus the ordinary Olympics, if you will.
You know, I think it's impacted in every way. So I think one of the things that I would normally ask in a meeting that I won't ask tonight. I teach close to almost 200 students a semester, and I ask about how many of you know that the Paralympic Games, what they are, when they take place, and most folks do not. And I think that just speaks to the lack of attention that is given to Paralympic athletes, even though we're talking about elite athletes that compete in the same venues, compete doing the same sports in a very, in an adaptive way. So when we think about my alpine skiers, folks that ski, imagine skiing and having no sight coming down that same course completely without any vision. That's the training and the preparation around that for our Paralympic athletes is tremendous. And not having the opportunity to train properly, not having the supports. One of the things that was kind of in flux was who were going to be the accredited guests that were going to be accompanying athletes. In previous Olympics, or when you think about the Olympics, if I were an elite athlete, I don't need an entourage. It's my social group that comes with me. I don't need people to help me carry my bags. But we look at Paralympic athletes, they may need help because of medical concerns. You have athletes that don't have arms, that don't have legs. So carrying the 100 pieces of apparel that they get from being a participant, what kind of supports are in place for that? There were a lot of those PCAs that did not get the accreditation, and right now are looking like they're probably not going to get that accreditation for Beijing as well. So the preparations, the support while there, and there's the Olympic spirit and the camaraderie, and what you get from participating in an event like this with the spectatorship and all those things, that's essentially has been eliminated, and we see that it's probably not going to come back again for Beijing as well. So the depression, the psychological impact of competing in a different way, I think is going to certainly impact the Paralympic athlete as compared to average athletes.
Certainly, the IOC has tried to package this as kind of a triumph over adversity and a triumph over COVID, if you will. Not everyone sees it that way. Professor Jordan, I was wondering if you might at least start us off by addressing the question, do you think that this has in some way damaged significantly the Olympic brand? And if so, what might be done about that, or can something be done about that?
Yeah, I think Professor Kingston mentioned that, at least public perception was we were doing this for financial reasons. I mean, if the games don't happen in 2021, I think I read that they would have to refund broadcast partners like $4 billion or some kind of really large amount of money. And so I'm sure at some point there are some very real financial implications for canceling the games completely. And again, I think as Professor Kingston said, does that make Japan, at least outside of Japan, be perceived as it was some kind of failure, that you couldn't pull this off? And so I think that there is this public perception that this was somewhat forced, and that it was maybe not in the best interest of obviously the host community, but even the athletes that were there to put these on. So I think it does, yeah, to answer your question, yes, I think there was some tarnish on the Olympic brand and the Olympic ideal for sure, because it made the commercial aspect of the Olympic Games, which is an important part, be able to do this, it kind of brought it front and center.
Would anyone else like to respond? Jeff?
Yeah, I totally agree with Jeremy. I mean, it was a real bad look for the IOC. I think they tarnished their reputation. Bach was perhaps at one point one of the most reviled characters in Japan. He sort of acted very arrogantly. He broke quarantine protocols. He acted very imperiously. And, you know, the press was pointing out like, well, the high-end hotel sector has their fingers crossed because all the suites and VIP rooms have been booked out by the IOC. So there's a sense that they're living in this rather, you know, golden cocoon and of privilege. And, you know, they're impervious to any criticism, and they really just pushed forward despite, you know, legitimate concerns. And it came out that they were essentially threatening legal action, that if Tokyo decided to pull out, who's going to refund the money to NBC and other sponsors? And the IOC would say, you're gonna pay. And so there was the prospect of an ugly legal battle looming. Again, this doesn't seem easy to reconcile with Olympic ideals.
Okay, anybody else? Okay, maybe one last question on this topic. The last couple of Olympics have been the first games in which social media has been a major form of communication. And I was wondering whether any of you had any sense on the impact of social media, either on the athletes or on the attitudes, the public attitudes towards the games, or on the games themselves.
I think that, for example, the athletes, the champions, the big athletes, during the pandemic in Europe, they started to use social much more than before to keep a contact with the supporters. And this was also an idea pushed by the sponsors. We had in Europe like 6-7 months with zero competition, and the sponsor, you know, were deciding if to keep investing money or not on sports. And some of the most famous athletes of any sport, they decide, you know, to push on Instagram and social media to keep a contact with people that was not able to see any competition.
Jerry?
Yeah, I think obviously, and this speaks beyond just the Olympic Games, but how we consume information now, especially news, has changed drastically. I mean, we utilize social media platforms to stay up to date with results of games, elections, whatever else is out there. So I think that has changed, especially from a host country and an IOC perspective, how they kind of control and disseminate information and want to do their outreach. From a public perspective, and we've seen this a lot here in the United States over the last year or so, it provides everyone a platform, and that's not always a good thing, but a platform to express ideas, opinions, information, misinformation, and all the not. So again, that probably for the host country presents challenges. If people with significant followings are putting out a certain narrative that may or may not align with what you want the narrative to be as a host country, you have to deal with that, where, you know, 10, 15, 20 years ago, that was really not the case.
Okay. Yes, Professor Kingston.
Yeah, well, it's a great branding opportunity for the Airweave mattress company because rumors circulated that these beds were not strong enough to withstand the various challenges that they might face during the games. And so it seemed that many of the athletes used them as trampolines and did sort of TikTok, videos. So I think Airweave must have thought, what a great branding opportunity. But also social media, I mean, it just, reached a very different demographic, young people, some of these new sports like skateboarding and bouldering and surfing, these aren't the traditional Olympic sports, but for young people, they're the exciting ones. And so in a way, you're reaching or you're increasing your audience. And a lot of the events became very popular on social media. I think some of the top athletes became great influencers in terms of every day talking about what's going on. One Greek water polo athlete became famous for launching a video app, not a video app, a dating app but it only functioned when the sun went down and stopped when the sun rose. So, there's all sorts of ways that social media, I think, enhance the Olympic experience. But, the other side of the coin was when Maury made his sexist comments 20 years ago, he would have survived, but social media bypasses the gatekeepers. And so one of the most popular terms on social media following his sexist remarks was rogai, or damage caused by old people. And so rogai was sort of a term that became very common on social media. And so it shows that social media does have a way of promoting transparency and accountability in very positive ways. Thank you.
Thank you.
Talking of communication, if I can add something what Professor Jordan just said, that communication has changed. I want to give the example of what happened in my country. The Italia Broadcasting TV bought the rights to show the Olympic Games, but they only bought for 2,000 hours of transmission. And then we had different platform that was very new for us. And with $8, with 8 US American dollars, I could see all the Olympic Games and I could see live all the events and I could pick up which events I wanted. So for a sport, lover, and there was something very new. So we could see the Olympics on the smartphone, on PC, and only for 8 hours with Discovery Plus channel. Which is something that here before we never had it.
And I know that was one disruption that actually caused some discomfort in some quarters in the United States, which is used to this pre-digested primetime sequence of events, usually featuring American athletes. But now they were having, if you want to see this, go here. If you want to see that, go there. This sport is on live on this streaming network. This is on something else. And some people, again, older people like me, mostly, I think, were very confused by this and really did not quite adjust to it very well. It also, I know one particular athlete who benefited from this was Belarusian, I forget what athlete she was, but she was kind of being sent home from the games and protested it and wound up, because her case became well known over social media, wound up being offered asylum in another country. So it did have some effects on some very real effects on some of the athletes. But I'd like to turn now. One of the major disruptions that this has caused is that we now have a Winter Olympics following almost immediately after the Paralympics. This in itself can have effects of Olympics overload, perhaps. It might dilute, has the potential for diluting again, the Olympic brand a little bit with too much all at once. Certainly the Olympics moved to this every 2-year cycle just to avoid that kind of problem. But it also is moving to a country that has shown very little hesitation in cracking down very, very severely on any kind of sign of a COVID outbreak. As we've seen in when they shut down Disneyland in what was it Beijing or Shanghai, and they locked in 30,000 people until they got everyone tested. And so I'd like to know, kind of looking ahead to the Beijing Games, one, do you see Chinese society treating all this very, very differently from Japan? And do you see any problems, specific, unique problems that it will be facing? So maybe just go around the group. So maybe Jeremy, would you like to start with that?
Dr. Blair, go ahead. You were unmuting there.
I was only because I was kind of involved in this kind of conversation this morning, and really Beijing was waiting to see exactly what happened in Tokyo as they were beginning to set up their plan for COVID. And the restrictions are, you know, the Chinese government is very heavily involved in the planning and the restrictions around things. So there will be mandates for vaccination. Again, we're, you know, looking at, you know, spectatorship being impacted. Only those, and I think we're still looking at a country of people that don't really want visitors coming in to potentially bring in new strands or you know, exacerbate whatever is going on now. So I think we've got there's a great flux right now, and the rules apparently are changing from day to day in terms of what the expectation is going to be, which is making the planning side of this, you know, tremendously difficult.
Professor Jordan, maybe you.
Well, I think the games coming so soon after the summer games is obviously a unique aspect of these games, and potentially might impact viewership. I still think we have a little bit of people missed out on watching sport for a while, and so they still want to do that. I would imagine, I have spent some time in Japan, and I love Japan, but I would imagine that how the Japanese government handled the Olympic Games and COVID-related protocols would be very different than perhaps what would be happening in China. And I think, I would imagine you'll see comparisons between the two countries on how things were handled and maybe what was better or more effective. But it is a little bit of a unique feeling that we're already a few weeks away from the Olympic Games again. So that is an interesting phenomenon.
Professor Kingston?
Well, the Winter Games always have attracted less interest than the Summer Games. So there is going to be a drop off anyway. If I recall, isn't back in the early 90s, didn't they sort of squish the Summer Olympics and Winter Olympics close when Lillehammer, Norway hosted the Winter Olympics, and it was not,
I think
it
that's
was like
actually
a year after the Barcelona. Yeah, so they sort of squished it together then. I think that, you know, you can't sort of divorce this from the larger geopolitical problems going on now, and sort of a new Cold War. Perceptions of China have turned rather negative over the crackdown on pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong, the abuses against the Uyghur minority. So I think there's sort of a general mood of vilification of China, and that certainly resonates here in Japan, which feels sort of on the front lines of China's regional hegemonic ambitions. So I think there will be some interest. People will, of course, be more interested if their country is doing better in the Olympics. But I think in general, it's going to go down anyway, just because it's the Winter Olympics. And now because it's being hosted by China. Recall back in 1980, the boycott of the Moscow Games. So there's no boycott going on in Beijing, but, the specter of, fanless games is rather eerie and haunting. You sort of lack that, excitement factor that's brought to the stands when, fans are cheering and stomping and things like that. So I think that's going to take a bit of the zest out of the games.
Professor Castiglione?
I think that when the IOC gave to China the organization of the Winter Games in a city like Beijing, which organized in 2008 the Summer Olympic Games. Once again in China, there is no talk about the human rights, and this is another reason, because what we said before about the rotation of the organization should be something that has to take place. I was in Beijing in the Summer Olympic Games, and then I was in Tokyo for the World Volleyball Championship. And a city like Beijing, so big, if you don't know that there are the games, you don't even understand that there are the games, because the city it's really big. I think that the supremacy of a country still. Some politicians still think that organizing these events can help politically the country. And, as we know, China can organize events like this each other day. So they will spend a lot of money, because I spoke the other day with the Paralympic national team, and they already knows that they will have different athletes villages. Usually there is only one big athlete villages, and now they will have more than one because they don't want to have people together. So we will see what will be the cost, but as we know, China, will use this event to once again to mean its supremacy.
Okay, Professor Castiglione raised an important issue, and it's been kind of circulating around in what several of the panelists have said. But the IOC has repeatedly, for decades, really since the 1930s, I can think back to the 1936 Berlin Games, that the IOC has repeatedly said that politics has no place in the games. And some people would say that is in itself a political statement. Do you feel that politics can be divorced from an event like the Olympics, or should it be divorced from an event like the Olympics? What are your feelings about this? Anyone?
I think it's challenging. I understand the ideals and the principle, but I think if you look at the last few games, it's very difficult to not see the political element of the games, especially within the host country. So, maybe in a country where there is an authoritarian regime, it's more likely to have less political aspect within the country. But we've already talked about the human rights issues with China and how that should be something that's discussed during this next game. So yeah, I think it's very difficult to separate.
I agree. I think it's impossible. You can't really insulate the games from the general political atmosphere. But scroll back to the '64 Olympics. the great celebration of Japan returning to the Comity of Nations following World War II. Japan had been rehabilitated, it's back, it's a high-tech economic success story, the miracle was ongoing. So in a way, that was a political rehabilitation of Japan following World War II. Then we had the 80 boycott of the Moscow Olympics. But then soon after that, South Korea was awarded the Olympics while the blood was still fresh in Gwangju, South Korea, where paratroopers opened up fire on unarmed pro-democracy demonstrators there. And so a lot of people are going, you're awarding South Korea the Olympics? I mean, that's just unconscionable given what the regime has done to its own people. But what happened is the media, poured in, they put the limelight in the dark corners. And in a way, you could argue the Olympics did give momentum to the pro-democracy movement. And when the 88 Olympics opened, Korea was already democratized. And that was something people were not predicting, 10 years before that. So I think South Korea stands out as a very positive example of how the Olympics can draw media attention to a country and put it under greater scrutiny. In the run-up to 2008, all across the world where they're having, the Olympic torch relay, there was pro-Tibet protests. So this, did again highlight some of the problems in China. So in some ways, it's supporting the authoritarian regime maybe, and that they can get a lot of mileage out of hosting the Olympics. But on the other side, it does draw media attention and to places perhaps that the leaders would prefer not to be so transparent. So I think it can cut both ways.
Any other perspectives?
No, I think that dividing politics and Olympics won't be easy, because only to be a candidate city for a country means to have to deal with politics. When you apply to be a candidate city, you need the political support, you need the financial support. So it's a decision by the politician. The National Olympic Committee may ask to the politician if they want to go for being candidate city, but then the last decision is from the politician that decide if they want to be part or not. So this is just to begin the run for the Olympics.
Okay. Deborah, do you have any, Dr. Blair, do you have anything you'd like to say?
No, I don't think I have anything additional to add. I mean, if as we study phenomena that happened across the years, certainly this year's, Beijing will be an interesting read, because we know that the government is heavily involved in the planning, and in every meeting that is being held around the planning, there is a government official that in it. So I don't see the separation, and it will be interesting to see, really what were the successes. Was there, any greater success with their control of the situation and handling COVID, or handling, spectatorship, perspective on, from the citizens on their view of what's happening in the country for the Olympics. I mean, I don't see a way to separate it. I think Francesco kind of, nailed it. Whenever you agree to be that host city, there is there's automatically a political involvement there.
Okay, well, then maybe one last question for the panel before we open the floor up. One of the things that we hear a lot of at Temple and in the world at large is we can't wait for COVID to be over and we can return to normal. But I think we all recognize that what was normal and what will be normal may not be the same thing. And I'd maybe like your perspectives on what you think the new normal might be like for the Olympics or for mega events like the Olympics in general. Is there some permanent change that you see as a result of what we and the Olympics have undergone over the last couple of years? Dr. Kingston?
Yeah, I think going back to our discussion about social media, I think that that is only going to grow in importance in terms of how we consume the Olympics. Suzanne mentioned, in the chat about Simone Biles and drawing attention to, mental, personal health problems. It makes us, I think, perhaps more empathetic to the struggles that athletes face. I think that athletes are connecting better with the fans. So I think that social media really, amplifies the importance of the Olympics around the world. And I think that that increases its viewership considerably. So I think that social media on balance is a positive thing for the Olympics. And you're right, the new normal isn't going to be that old normal that we were used to. And we're not really clear where that's going to be going. I'll leave it there.
Mr. Castiglione, do you have any thoughts on the matter?
No, it's my long conversation with the Paralympic national team the other day. They told me that there was an example of the Australian team that during the Olympics they didn't send the athletes to eat, in the big hall, and they had the catering service to the rooms with specific diet for athlete. And he thinks, this manager thinks that this is something that in the future they will keep it, because in this way they can control better the athlete. This is against the Olympic spirit, but it depends how the pandemic will grow. One of the nicest things you can see in the Olympics is to visit the athlete village, where you have thousands of people gathering together. So there are different point of views. If you see from an organizational part, or if you see as an athlete, as a coach. So it's not very easy, but I'm sure Santi will remain.
Professor Blair.
I think the one thing that I think we'll like about some of the changes is this freedom and the level of advocacy that athletes will have for themselves. We saw Rule 50, the Olympic Charter and the athlete expression, which talks about, there can be no protests, demonstration, political, religious, or racial, protests permitted at any of the Olympic sites. And so there was a relaxing of that amendment this round. So what I envision kind of moving forward in terms of a major change that will have significant impact is the athletes having a voice. I think, like Suzanne made note, using social media, whatever platform, or the Athlete 365 platform that's been created, so that they feel like they have an investment in what's happening around them, and being able to showcase some of their platforms. I think one of the recommendations out of that athlete committee was the changing of the oath to include words like inclusion and respect and things of that nature, that the branding of the villages would have language that would speak about peace, respect and inclusion. And I think given everything that's happened in the world, if we can use the Olympics, which has been that moment where we can unite, unite folks through sport, if we can get to that level, I think, we can continue to see sport as a change agent, especially in the areas of inclusion.
Okay, thank you. Professor Jordan.
I think from a tourism perspective, the next games in 2024, I don't think COVID will have gone away. I'm guessing. I'm not a health expert, but I think it's still going to be impacting travel and people's willingness to travel in mass to a destination, especially in another country. And so I think as people plan for 2024, especially the host organizers, they have to be mindful of that and what the implications could be on attendance at their games.
Okay, thank you. And with this, I would like to open the floor to any questions that our audience members may have. And you put them in the chat. Okay.
I want to comment while we're waiting for folks to put some questions in the chat. I think this has been such a fascinating discussion, and to really think about, these sort of contrasting values, the ethics and ideals of the sport with the political issues and the economic implications. And it's the perception, I guess the IOC has done a good job of branding the Olympics, because there is this perception that it is beneficial for countries to host the Olympics. So thank you for kind of highlighting the potential issues surrounding that and all of the political and economic implications, in addition to the inequities that you've delved into here. So really interesting. Thank you.
Can I turn it around? Mike, you've been rather modest. You are leading authority on the economics of the games. What's your sense of the implications for the pandemic Olympics going forward on the economics of the games?
Well, one of the things that I try to do as an economist is to separate the three interest groups, if you will. There's the IOC, there's what I call the OCOG, the Organizing Committee of the Olympic Games, and there's the host city or country. And what I see the pandemic is having done is really affecting the first two, and much less the third. Now that's something that maybe we haven't made this distinction very much in our discussion here. But the added expenses of largely, not solely, but have largely been of staging the games, and that falls on the OCOG. The dangers of the loss of sponsorships, especially television broadcast, that endangers the IOC. The loss of tourism, I would contend, is not that serious a problem, because one of the things we have seen is that Olympic tourists tend to displace other tourists. And so the net gain of tourism from a mega event is a matter of considerable dispute among economists. When I say a matter of considerable dispute, I mean most studies have really found that there's the effect is much less than has been contended. So the problem that Tokyo faced was there was no one to displace. And so the problem really, though, was COVID and not, its impact on the Olympics, that there were just no tourists of any kind. But most economists would say really the big benefit to the Olympics, of the Olympics to an economy, really occurs in the buildup to the games, in the building of infrastructure, in the employment of people in the construction industry, in the employment of people to deal with the run-up to the games. And that's where the big benefit comes from. And so in that sense, in terms of the economics, we would say that Tokyo probably suffered less, the city of Tokyo suffered less than probably a lot of people think it did.
I'll let people know.
We have a question from Brian Michael, who asks, how will broadcasting the Olympics change, especially in the United States? Again, more streaming services, that the Olympics were a big factor in the launching of NBC's streaming service, Peacock. We had far smaller media representations at the games than we've ever had before. Do you see this persisting? Any response to that?
I think that all the medias, they have the interest to tell the story of the Olympics. I mean, the Olympics are fascinating, and they will do the best to tell the story of the Olympics. I don't think that they will send less media. Now technology help a lot. I mean, years ago, to do a live streaming, you should have a truck and a dish. Now you can do with the telephone easily. You can do a live. But the idea for media is to tell the story of the people in the Olympics. So I think there will be always a massive coverage. Of course, the platform will change, and there will be different platform, and it will be easier for everyone to look from everywhere. The only channel years ago was to watch TV if your nation will broadcast the Olympics. Now everyone in every place has access to the event.
Anyone else? I would say that this is really part of a much broader movement, that we're seeing a major disruption in media, probably even bigger than the advent of cable, because we're seeing now it's not just the Olympics, that you can now watch NFL football on Amazon Prime, that you can follow baseball games on MLB.com, and we're seeing massive cord cutting in the sense of people no longer subscribing to cable services. And you're seeing, ESPN lay off dozens of workers, is one, result of this. So I think this is part of a much broader movement, and I think we are going to see a move away from the traditional broadcast media into streaming services. But that's part of a bigger movement that's not just restricted to the Olympics.
But journalists, this is a plum assignment. They're dying for the chance to go cover the Olympics. So they're begging their editors, please send me, doing whatever it takes. So, AP had a reporter here 4 years before the games. He was, a specialist on the Olympics. He's their Olympics guy, Steve Wade. And so, it's amazing. AP invested so much money in covering the lead up to the Olympics. And, he produced many great stories. Now, one thing I just wanted to raise here, we just finished COP26. Okay, maybe it was a bit of a fiasco, but we're not really talking about the carbon footprint. I mean, the Tokyo Games probably had the lowest carbon footprint in the last, couple of decades, right? Nobody came. But they don't get any credit for having the most environmentally friendly Olympics in some time. Everybody focuses on dumping the radiated water from Fukushima into the bay and things like that. But there were some positives here. So I wanted to end on an upbeat note there.
Okay. And on that very happy note, I want to thank all of our participants. Again, one staying up quite late, one getting up extremely early. But I also want to thank Professor Blair and Professor Jordan for joining us from the Philadelphia area, and to thank Suzanne Williver for putting all this together.
Pleasure. Thank all of
Thank you, Suzanne. Great job. Thanks, Mike. Good moderating.
Thank you. It's fantastic. Fantastic.
Everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.